It's true. Environmentally, the absolute worst thing that you can do is flying. What is interesting is that air travel only accounts for about 2.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. As such, it contributes far less to the climate crisis than something like automobile use or eating beef. Other things that you may not think of at all contribute as much or more to the crisis. For example, 2% of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from the manufacture of aluminum, 5% from making cement. Who knew, right? So why is air travel so bad if it's currently such a small percentage of the problem globally? Like many things related to the climate crisis, it is useful to approach this personally. We often ignore or avoid this approach as it can make us more than a little uncomfortable, and as it requires us to look at our own actions rather than the actions of some corporation or politician, which we absolutely should do also. But looking at our own actions is important. In fact, it's essential. It's hard to imagine a way for one person to contribute to the climate crisis more quickly than by flying. If you take a round trip, flight from LA to Paris, which would have you in the air for a little under 24 hours, you would have caused 3 tons of carbon dioxide to be directly emitted into the upper atmosphere. Incidentally, if you fly first class, you would have contributed twice that amount, 6 tons. The next time, that you wish you were flying first class, remember this. It is literally twice as bad for the planet. And of course, for all you aspiring Cardassians, taking a personal jet is off the chart when it comes to inflicting as much harm to the planet as quickly as possible. There really should be some sort of award for this kind of unconscionable behavior. Maybe we could call it something like the Worst Planetary Citizen Award. Instead, we see it as glamorous. In any event, in addition to CO2, other gases emitted by your plane, such as mononitrogen oxides, that's a mouthful, increase your short-term climate impact by as much as 2 or 3 times more. So, if air travel is so bad, which it absolutely is, how is it that it only accounts for 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions? The problem is that traveling by air is a practice exclusive to the wealthiest, most privileged people on the planet. In fact, flying is in some sense the iconic display of privilege. For over 70 years now, we have referred to the world's most privileged people as the jet set. Conversely, 19 out of 20 people on the planet have never set foot in an airplane. Even among Americans, half do not fly annually. Frequent rather than occasional flyers are obviously the biggest problem. By some estimates, 80% of all flights are made by just 1% of the people on the planet. Although the term jet set has obviously lost its cachet over the decades, now that all sorts of people can fly coach, it is nonetheless a global elite that is still doing all this flying and contributing to the climate crisis in this way. You may not think of yourself as a global elite or a member of the jet set, but if you fly, you are. But 19 random people from across the planet in a room with you, and just by virtue of the fact that you occasionally fly, you may well be the only jet setter in the room. If you're a frequent flyer, put 100 random people in a room, and you will be contributing more to the climate crisis in this way than anyone else in the room. You may not think of yourself as a member of the 1%, i.e. the world's wealthiest, most privileged people, but you would be among the 1% doing the lion's share of all this flying. In which case, air travel could be doubling or tripling your personal climate footprint. Repeat that. It could be doubling or tripling your personal climate footprint. So let's pause on that for a moment. Even though you may be trying to reduce your carbon footprint in a variety of ways, such as by eating a largely plant-based diet, not owning a car, buying less stuff, so forth. If you fly, this activity could easily, single-handedly nullifying all the gains of your otherwise environmentally conscientious lifestyle. So let's get specific here. In order to meet the goals of the Paris Accord, which was established, of course, at COP21, everyone on the planet should emit, on average, no more than 2 metric tons of CO2 per year. In a single 24-hour period, that flight from LA to Paris, you would thus expend your entire CO2 allocation for a year and a half. 3 years if you fly first class. Factor in other greenhouse gases emitted, and it is 2 or 3 times worse even than that. If only 5% of the world's population is responsible for air travel, what would happen if the rest of the world began to follow our dubious example? In fact, this is what is now happening. For example, air travel in China recently increased by 50% in just 5 years. So what's to be done? 3 things come to mind. One with respect to business travel, another recreational travel, and a third applies to both. First, the one that applies to both business and recreational travel is simple enough, though not necessarily easy to enact. Fly less. Instead of multiple business trips or vacations, consolidate as much as possible. For example, instead of 2 short vacations that require flying every year, why not have 1 grand one every 5 years, thus reducing your flights by a factor of 10? Flying less does not necessarily mean just consolidating trips, but breaking them into parts as well. For example, travel by train is one of the most efficient ways of getting around, and hence a relatively small climate footprint, as opposed to air travel, which is arguably the most environmentally problematic. So traveling overland by train and across oceans could make sense. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to fly from my home in Santa Barbara, which is near Los Angeles, to London. First, I could take a bus or train to LA. While there are nonstop flights from London to LA, many in fact have connections in New York City. Instead of doing these 2 legs by plane, the first could be done by train and the second by airplane, thereby cutting the air miles almost in half. Having traveled across the country by train, I can tell you that it was a really wonderful experience that years later I still look back on pretty fondly. Regarding business travel in particular, a big part of the solution may be telepresencing of one sort or another. I know, when many people think of telepresencing, we imagine the, transporter from Star Trek. But telepresencing is indeed being transported across great distances by way of some form of technology. But the fact is, the practical telepresencing is already here and has been for over a century. Radio technology allowed our voices, at least, to be present at far-off places. Not long after, television also allowed live images to be transmitted at a distance. Telephones, first wired, though now largely radio, allowed us to conduct real-time, interactive conversations around the world. And of course, the internet and cellular networks made practical and affordable technologies like Skype and FaceTime that allow 2 or more people to see, hear, and interact with each other in real time. This particular technology has now advanced to the point that well over 1 billion people on the planet literally carry highly advanced versions of it in our back pockets, as smartphones allow us to conduct conversations with high-definition video that now rivals broadcast standards. So what does all this have to do with the climate crisis? It's simple enough. We expend an enormous amount of energy transporting our bodies around, often in environmentally disastrous ways like automobiles and airplanes, when just seeing and hearing each other would do. This is not to say that telepresencing is the same as a face-to-face encounter. However, when we consider that the climate footprint of such encounters can be 100 times smaller than a face-to-face meeting, the trade-off is, as far as I am concerned, well worth it for the sake of the planet and our future. Moreover, social media has challenged us to reconsider how meaningful human interaction occurs. Many people find relationships that they make and maintain online to be nearly as valuable as their face-to-face ones. So, regarding recreational air travel, let's say that you make a commitment to stop or dramatically reduce flying starting today. How then do you travel in the sense of visiting new places and experiencing new things without flying there? You could just throw up your hands in frustration and say, screw it, I guess I just won't travel then. Unfortunately, when we hear about the environmental problems of air travel, many people may well assume that this is what the future holds. Is it then, any wonder or surprising that they want to hold on to the present and to their boarding passes for as long as possible? Alternately, you could accept the challenge of the future and start imagining new possibilities, in some cases really appealing possibilities. With respect to recreational air travel, an interesting alternative is the emerging slow travel movement. I know, slow travel, but yep. It's a thing. For example, let's assume I wanted to take a vacation from my home in Santa Barbara to San Francisco, which is 300 miles away. I could fly there, which would take just over an hour and which would be an unpleasant and environmentally disastrous thing. This is not, however, my only option. I could, for example, take the train up, which would add about 8 hours to my travel time. Setting aside the environmental advantages of such a trip, I imagine it would be a pretty nice way to spend a day, just sitting back and enjoying a large chunk of the California coast. Of course, I would also have other options. One of the most radical would be if I traveled up on my pedelec bike, which is an electric bike that's assisted as I pedal it, riding 4 or 5 hours a day and spending the rest of the time exploring local areas, staying at Airbnbs. Such a trip would take about 3 days and then about 3 days back. Now, some people will scoff, maybe even laugh at the very idea of traveling in such a way. However, the nascent slow travel movement argues for trips of just this kind, as well as mass transit options like trains. Like slow fashion, and before it's slow food, this movement challenges the cultural status quo and indeed it seeks to upend it. Spending hours preparing a meal, starting with buying the ingredients at a local farmer's market and just slowly preparing all its dishes, let alone if we grow the food ourselves, can seem absolutely absurd when compared to a fast food restaurant where you can buy and eat a meal in under 10 minutes. Similarly, spending hours of your time knitting a hat or sewing a shirt may seem ludicrous when you could buy one from a fast fashion outlet for under $10. Nonetheless, in the past few decades, slow food has slowly become a real cultural force. Slow fashion may not be far behind. Decades ago, the architects of the slow food movement, frustrated with the present, imagined a bold new future. It took quite a while, but at least where I live, California, the future has arrived, and for many people, it decidedly includes healthy portions of slow food. One of the reasons that the slow food movement succeeded was that it had much to recommend it. The same can be said of the slow travel movement. At the risk of rolling out a cliche, life really is about the journey, not the destination. This truism is completely lost on the fast travel industry, where the journey is reduced to a few altogether uncomfortable hours packed into and jostling around in a loud airplane. So let's return to my imagined trip up the coast on an electric bike. Frankly, making this trip with my wife and young daughter sounds like it could be a pretty magical experience that could stay with us for years. I can think of no better way to experience the California coast. Of course, it would not be all about the destination of San Francisco. Indeed, San Francisco would become just part of the journey. Yes, the transition to slow travel would impact the air travel industry, but whole new possibilities would open up, such as better mass transit and bicycle infrastructure, both of which are sorely needed. While whole towns that are not traditional destinations would nonetheless be able to play a significant role in a new slow travel industry. In any event, I'm curious to hear what you think. Is it time to write air travel out of our lives, or at least greatly reduce? And if so, how do we begin reducing it? Flying less? Telepresencing? Slow travel? Do you have other ideas?